When you're hiring, there's a lot to consider. Beyond the raw skills of performing a job, one of the most important considerations when hiring is that of scope, of perspective, ensuring that the candidate has the perspective to not only handle the job, but to excel in it. How do you determine that? I can help you there. This is the 7th video in my series on scope, the perspective of your role in the organization. We're looking at scope through the scope chart that I introduced in the first video in this series. If you missed that first video, you might want to start there. It's easy to see why hiring someone with a more strategic perspective is important in the middle or the top of the scope chart, but it really begins right at the origin. When you hire someone at the most fundamental roles in a company, the key hiring criteria are the skills. Whether they have already demonstrated the skills or can acquire them, near the origin of the scope chart, the focus is largely on doing the job, moving through the necessary work to accomplish the task. But almost immediately, the concern moves from simply being able to do the work to things that find their way onto the scope chart. You begin to want more from an employee than the robotic performance of their job. For example, they need to be able to work with others. Most roles require at least some ability to work with others, be they customers, peers, or supervisors. Workers need to be able to interface with customers in some reasonable fashion, or need to be able to get work from others and deliver their output to others still. Some roles even require multiple people to work together to simply accomplish the task. So quickly, the movement up the organizational axis on the scope chart begins. Few roles in a team are truly at the origin where they work entirely independently. Therefore, when you're hiring people, you look at aspects of performance on the scope chart's vertical axis, the organization. Do they interact well with others, treat them with respect, know how to communicate well enough to do the job well? Do they have some concern for their peers, enough to enable appropriate handoffs, and so on? Almost immediately, you're not looking at simply the bottom of the organizational axis. The same is true on the time dimension. Very few roles are robotic in nature, and all that matters is the immediate now. Most roles require at least some concern for the future. It could be as simple as planning ahead to the next step in the task, doing this step in this way so that the next step is more efficient. Maybe that's cleaning up the workplace so people coming in tomorrow can start promptly. Maybe that's ensuring you place an order for needed inputs before you run out so you avoid idle time. Even at the very origin of the time axis, some look out on the timeline is valuable and expected. So even when you're hiring at the origin of the scope chart, you're using it to look up and out in organization and time. And you can use the chart as a guide to make sure you're thinking about those aspects, using it as a reminder to ask questions and look for experience in thinking about those other than themselves, in looking at least a little bit into the future. You should be considering scope in addition to skills when hiring, even when at the most fundamental level. You can ensure that your new hire is suitable for now and the near future. As you move further up the scope chart in hiring, considering the additional perspectives moves from nice to have to essential. Hiring for any kind of management role, even a frontline supervisor, requires consideration of their agility in both the organizational and time dimensions. The further up the org chart you go, the more essential these strategic skills become. At a frontline supervisor role, the ability to work across the organization is essential. A supervisor needs to consider the implications of their team's work on the other similar teams, to load balance, to schedule match, to even consider cross-team movement of people to maximize productivity. They also need to consider the team's role in accomplishing the larger organization's objectives and how best to optimize for that. The best frontline managers are deeply organizationally aware, even at their comparatively low level in the organization. On the time dimension, a frontline supervisor would be derelict in their duty without some consideration for the future. for at least schedule planning, but also for resource planning and team development. The best frontline managers are ones who play an important role in budgeting and the strategic planning for what the organization can accomplish over at least the next year. And they also play a key role in developing the talent on their team with an eye to the future as well. So even at the first line manager level, using the scope chart to help remind you of the kinds of characteristics you're looking for in filling those roles can be helpful. It helps to keep the organization and time dimensions in your mind as you formulate job requirements, interview questions, and evaluation criteria. By the time you reach the hiring of a director level role, the emphasis on the technical or other skills is far less, and the skills represented on the scope chart reach the forefront. The focus has moved well out of the how zone, fully into the what zone, and is rapidly approaching the why zone. A great director candidate will be comfortable on the organizational axis. They'll be deft at working across broad swaths of the organization. They're well-versed at finding connections far and wide in the organization, at communicating to people up and down the org chart, at presenting more complex issues to the senior-most people in the company. They're also comfortable with the future. They understand the strategic need for the company to plan not just next year, but years into the future. They have an understanding of their industry to be able to see the near-term directions, and they can help their teams to build planning for those years. When you're searching for people further up the scope chart, it's important to notice the scale and how it changes. The higher you go, the larger and larger the organizational view is. As a frontline supervisor, they need to see peer teams and perhaps the division. As a director, it's the division and even most of the whole company. At the top of the chart, the whole company and the world. The scale of the candidate needs to change to match. As you go up, you want people who are comfortable working at organizational scale, not simply one-to-one. When you consider the time dimension, here too the scale changes. A frontline supervisor considers months at a time. As you move up, the view is quarters and years. A CEO needs to be thinking in terms of the lifespan of the company, often in decade-long perspective. Here too, as you go up, you need to look for people who are able to look well beyond day to day and think far into the future. What all these growing changes do is affect how you should be thinking about the requirements for these various jobs. Closer to the origin, details are king. You need roles with a focus on minutia and people who relish this kind of data and detail. It's all about the how. As you move up, the job requirements should be noticeably different. Less attention on the details, more on concepts. Less focus on hard skills like technical ability or manual mastery, and more focus on the soft skills like communication and persuasion. It becomes more about what and why. The scope chart can be a good check for these. If you develop a scope chart at scale for your organization, you can use it to monitor whether you're focused on the right dimensions at each level. When you outline a second-level manager, you can, for example, check to make sure the job requirements don't focus on the daily issues, but rather the near-term planning and results. You can confirm that the focus is not on the individual worker performance, but rather team performance, and that the communication skills you're looking for are commensurate with that level as well. You can use these guides as a way to formulate the candidate's interview. At the lower level, there you can focus on skills assessment. As you go up, the focus moves more to problem solving. Further up, it's more their ability to communicate, their ability to distill complex issues to their essential components. The higher you go, the less it becomes a test, and the more it becomes a conversation. The scope chart is a useful tool in hiring and a way to ensure that you're focusing on the right things at each level. I encourage all good leaders to use it as a tool to help them develop the best hiring process they can, one that is appropriate for each level up and down the scope chart. In the next video, we'll again consider the all-important strategic view and how you can use the scope chart to measure and build your strategic prowess. How you can use that to advance your career. But that's next time. Be sure to subscribe to my channel and click the bell so you won't miss each new video in this series. I'll see you next time in Using Scope in Your Career.